So, welcome to the podcast, Brandy.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. I'm happy to be here.
So, can you share your background and how you became a fertility awareness instructor?
Yeah, so I had a lot of personal experience with using fertility awareness methods as natural birth control personally in my own cycle and learning about my own fertility before I became an instructor. So
Hmm.
I had struggled for many years on hormonal birth control. I
Hmm.
had really negative side effects and was really only pushed around from one hormone to the next and switched around and had just awful symptoms and side effects, and did several years of that before I just simply couldn't take it anymore and needed to find a way to support my hormones but also prevent pregnancy without needing to be on hormonal birth control. And so through that I found fertility awareness methods and began tracking my cycle, learning about my own fertility, how it worked, and how I could use this wisdom regarding my body to prevent pregnancy naturally. And so while I haven't embarked on my own pregnancy journey just yet as a fertility awareness instructor, now that I've gone on to train with the Natural Family Planning Teachers Association, I get to not only teach women these same tools that I've used now for 7+ years to prevent pregnancy, but how to leverage them to optimize their fertility and to get pregnant naturally when they're ready.
And can you share what those symptoms were that you experienced with the hormonal birth control?
Yeah, of course. So I didn't realize in the beginning that they were even related to hormonal birth control because that's not something that a lot of doctors had shared with me. And
Right.
so it took a little while to figure out the correlation. But looking back, I know for a fact that some of the major symptoms were yeast infections that I had
Hmm.
never had before in my life that started within months of going on the birth control pill. And over the course of the 3+ years I was on the pill, I actually had 50 yeast infections
Oh
in
my God,
just
wow.
4 years. It was traumatizing, and I was in my late teens and early 20s, so had only really become sexually active. So I had a really traumatic time with those first few years of being sexually active, embracing my hormones, my fertility. And then I also experienced mental health symptoms like anxiety, panic attacks, depression that were really affecting my everyday life. And then I realized kind of later down the road that a lot of my digestive issues and inflammation and skin issues were probably all related to the hormonal birth control as well, but couldn't discover that until I had taken the time to go off of it and really connect to my own body.
Oh, wow. So, how does the fertility awareness work?
Yeah, so the main things we're looking at when we're talking about fertility awareness are cervical fluid, which a lot of
Hmm.
people who I will say non-trackers, folks that
Hmm.
who aren't in the cycle tracking world, kind of just call that vaginal discharge. But really,
Right.
there's a lot more going on to it. And hormonally, there's a lot of things at play to make that. And so in the tracking world, we call that cervical fluid. And we're also tracking basal body temperature, which is our temperature first thing in the morning. And we're tracking shifts and changes in our cervix, which we can manually reach inside and touch and see how
Hmm.
it's changing throughout a cycle. And then we're also tracking body symptoms like ovulation pressure, potential spotting or breast changes, skin issues to see where we are at in our current cycle. So it's all about real time information for that specific cycle. And we can use all of that information to both prevent pregnancy by avoiding unprotected intercourse in our fertile window, or we can use it to get pregnant once we've identified that fertile window and we concentrate those pregnancy achievement attempts within that fertile space of time in that month cycle.
Right. And do you want to go over the two types of mucus that we tend to be able to see for the
Yeah,
listeners?
so um, I tend to even talk about the cervical mucus or cervical fluid as more than just two types, but you're kind of right. There's like two types we see that we consider the fertile types, and then there's the non fertile type as well. And so for fertile type, when we're looking at conceiving, we're really talking about what we call peak cervical fluid, which is that egg white like cervical fluid. And it really does look like clear, slippery, goopy, raw egg whites. And it can be shocking at first if you're not used to noticing it, or if you've been on hormonal birth control for a long time, because hormonal birth control will shift what our cervical fluid looks like. And so when we're off of it and cycling naturally, we have these really clear shifts in cervical fluid. And that peak fluid, which is best for conception, is that egg white type fluid. But we also have a few cervical fluid types leading up to that that we keep track of when we're using fertility awareness tools. And the one that precedes that peak fluid we call the creamy or milky stage, and it does look like hand lotion or liquidy and white like milk. And even before that, sometimes we just see or even feel just like a watery, runny sensation. And so these are signs that we are in our fertile window. And depending on what your goals are, conception or prevention of pregnancy, you decide how you want to use that space and time in your month. And then once we've ovulated, we often see this shift because of the introduction of progesterone that happens. There's this thickening in cervical fluid. So we get this thick, kind of white, tacky, or crumbly, sticky type fluid that creates almost like a barrier, and it keeps sperm from getting into the cervix while we're in that non-fertile phase of our cycle.
That's great. And so, yeah, a lot of people don't really notice the difference. I teach this as well with my patients, but I do love hearing everybody's perspective because there's always something that I can learn. And so it's interesting because a lot of people will get these apps and track their periods. And based on that, it gives them an estimation of when they're fertile. And then it typically goes like right in the middle, right in the center. So can you talk about that and why that can be actually misleading?
Yes. Yeah, I love this question. Everyone wants to ask me, what app do I get? And I am the poster child for paper charts. All of my clients have paper charts. They're using pen and pencil and they're writing it down because the apps, as you're mentioning, can get a little confusing. We're adding in our current cycle information, cervical fluid, temperature, whatever shifts we're seeing, and it's spitting out information to us. But what we don't always realize is these apps are based on algorithms. And so they take into account, a lot of them, this database of women's cycles and cycle information and how to estimate and determine fertile windows based on a cohort of thousands or hundreds of women, depending on what app is being used. And while we're entering our personal data, we're also kind of getting thrown into that algorithm. And so you're right, they shoot out these fertile windows that are not as real time as it would be if we were using paper charts and just looking at our personal cycle. And so the fertile window times are often off by a day or two on either side. And when we're talking conception or prevention, that's hugely important.
It is. Yeah, for sure. And then a lot of times people will focus just on that peak day.
Yes.
Can you talk about why it's important to also focus on other days?
Yes, I love this question. So this always makes me think of when we're watching TV and movies and women rush out from the bathroom like, I'm ovulating, let's go get it on if we're going to get pregnant. And I'm like, this is horrible advice. What is happening? It doesn't work like that. And so it's interesting, while ovulation is this 24-hour event, our chances of conception aren't narrowed into intercourse on that one day. And so truthfully, how it works is sperm lives in our body for up to 5 days, especially if we have this optimal cervical fluid. And if we're waiting for that peak day of the last day of cervical fluid or the day of our temperature rise or when we think we've ovulated, we're often a little bit too late, because really we need to be leveraging those days that lead up to ovulation, because the way conception happens is sperm is introduced into the woman's body. It needs cervical fluid to travel through the cervix, through the uterus. Conception happens in the fallopian tubes. It takes a little while for this whole process to go down. And if we're waiting for that last peak cervical fluid day or that temperature rise, we're on the very tail end of that fertile window, and we're often too late.
Right. Totally. And also, I wanted to talk about how, it's often called like the fifth vital sign when we look at our menstrual cycle. And can you talk about how cycle tracking can reveal underlying hormone imbalances?
Yeah. Yeah, this is another major way that I use fertility awareness tools, especially with my background as a women's healing arts coach, because we have all of this incredible hormonal health data at our fingertips when we're using fertility awareness methods, whether it be for pregnancy achievement or prevention, we still have access to all that information. And so when we're tracking cervical fluid temperature and these body shifts, we're able to see what's going on in real time in terms of our hormones. And that's because cervical fluid is made, it's triggered to be created by rising levels of estrogen. And so if we aren't seeing much, if any, production of cervical fluid, we could be looking at lower levels of estrogen. Or if we're seeing this overabundance of cervical fluid, especially once ovulation's happened and that fertile window's closed, we could be looking at excess levels of
Hmm.
estrogen. And we can see that right by tracking using fertility awareness tools. And then when we're talking about temperature, well, the major thing is if we're not seeing that temperature spike that happens at the end of the cervical fluid days, then ovulation may not have happened. And so any attempts for pregnancy may have been futile if ovulation just didn't occur in that cycle. So we can use temperature to say, hey, is this an ovulatory cycle? And if not, we need to work on supporting the hormonal health so that we're having healthy, regular ovulatory cycles.
Hmm.
Yeah, we also get to use temperature as a tool for looking at progesterone because progesterone is the hormone that triggers our temperature to rise. And so if the temperature rise is quite low or not sustained, there may be issues then with lower levels of progesterone, which throws in that whole added element of is there even enough progesterone for implantation to happen, which is the second important thing for pregnancy, not just fertilization of the egg, but implantation to sustain the pregnancy through the end of that cycle and beyond.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people before even they don't want to deal with tracking their cycle, so they'll get the LH sticks. Can you talk
Mm-hmm.
about why that is not a solution?
Yes. Yeah. So I will have clients who like using LH sticks and if they use them, I ask that they use them alongside tracking
Mhm.
because it's really only attempting to narrow in on one specific spike that happens in our cycle. So estrogen spikes before ovulation happens, and that triggers an LH spike, which is supposed to trigger the egg to be released from the ovary.
Right.
But by simply tracking or simply taking LH strips, we don't know what happens. We're just assuming, okay, I got an LH spike, so
Right.
ovulation must be happening right after this. We're making assumptions. But
Yeah.
when we're tracking temperature and these other signs, we're not making assumptions. We know what's going on.
Right. Totally. Because LH basically just shows that your body is trying to ovulate. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that the body actually responded. But a lot of people think, that should be enough. It's showing me that I ovulated. So it is such an important thing to mention, which is why I find charting like the gold standard.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And I wanted to talk to you about specifically what you use, which is the sympto-thermal method.
Hmm.
What is different about that?
Yeah, so like nothing and everything at the same time. So to understand the sympto-thermal method is to understand that when we talk about fertility awareness methods, we're not talking about one method, which is a little confusing because of the popular book,
Mhm.
Taking Charge of Your Fertility, where they talk about the fertility awareness method. There are
Mhm.
actually many different kinds, and the one that's discussed in that book is the sympto-thermal single check method. But within that, there are the which is often called the Billings ovulation method. There's the temperature only method. There are a few other ones, and the symptothermal method takes both the cervical fluid and the temperature only and puts them together. And
Hmm.
so it's combining both the impending ovulation tool of cervical fluid with the post ovulation tool of temperature, and bringing them together to say, now we can talk about signs that show us ovulation is trying to happen, and then
Hmm.
signs that show us it did or didn't happen. And so the sympto-thermal method comes at the fertile window from both the beginning and the end, which makes it inherently a bit more effective when we're talking about natural birth control or conception. And then to add on to it, I also practice and teach the sympto-thermal double check method, which is a mouthful. But what that does is looks at our past cycles to say, did I have a cycle where I ovulated really early? And if
Hmm.
so, what are the earliest possible chances of ovulation in my cycles? Because that's just important to be aware of if we're talking birth control or conception. So we know that our cycles aren't like clockwork, and what are the chances in our cycles that we could be much earlier or much later than we expected. And so the sympto-thermal method comes at that fertile phase from lots of different angles.
Right. And so, as far as tracking fluid, I mean, I personally see it. A lot of my patients do. Some people just don't really know how to track it. Like, what would be the best way for people to see what kind of cervical fluid or mucus they have?
Yeah, this is a great question. I don't often advocate for women to like go inside their vaginas and searching around. I often find that it's present, and it really should be present. You should see it or feel it when
Mhm.
you're walking around or when you're wiping after going to the bathroom. I do encourage women to touch it, to feel it, to slide it between your fingers, to get familiar with it. And so I often recommend first thing in the morning when women wake up to go to the bathroom and with clean fingers touch the outside of their vaginal opening and just see what's there, see what it looks like, see what it feels like. Then notice what's on the toilet paper. And then when you walk around throughout the day, what does it feel? Does it feel wet or does it feel dry? Do
Mhm.
you notice anything on your underwear? And then not just leaving it as, oh, well, I checked in the morning, I'm done, but noticing it all throughout the day, because cervical fluid doesn't care if it's the morning or the evening, it can shift
Mhm.
throughout the day. And so staying on top of what are the different types you might even see in one day. So I like to encourage women to get familiar with their bodies. It's not something to be afraid of. You don't have
Yeah.
to microscopically look at like toilet paper or anything. Like, you can touch it, you can feel it. It's a part of your body and a part of your health.
Absolutely. And then you talked about, which I also suggest if people are comfortable with it, if they're in the shower, to go in and feel their cervix.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it really is amazing, but you can feel such a difference. It feels like plastic on infertile days, and then it feels like soft on fertile days. So can you talk about that, like how people can get deeper if they want to, so to speak?
Yeah. Yeah. The cervix tracking is so interesting. I have some clients who are like, I cannot wait. I didn't know I could touch my cervix. This is
Mhm.
fantastic.
Yeah,
And
because
I have
people are
other
like, I
people,
don't know, it's too far. And I'm like, no, you can actually feel it.
yeah. Yeah, totally. And then there's other people who are like, I'm just not there yet. And so I
Yeah.
totally understand. And we
Mhm.
do call it like a bonus tracking sign because
Yeah.
it's helpful, but it's not necessary. But I do encourage everyone who's willing or curious to give it a try, because you're right. It's right there. And we're kind of
Mhm.
taught about our female anatomy like it's this mysterious, vast
True.
land that we can't access. But the cervix is right there. And so
It is. It's amazing, right? Because people think it's like this, I don't know, somewhere like untouchable, but you can feel it.
yeah. And I think it's important too for anyone who's using like tampons or menstrual cups or menstrual discs, or even wanting to get pregnant or to have a baby, like reach up and find this magnificent part of your body that's allowing all of this to happen. You're
Yeah.
covering your cervix with your menstrual cup. It's where your menstrual blood is coming from. It's where your beautiful baby will come out of. And so
Hmm.
getting familiar with this powerful part of your body,
Yeah.
and the ways that I
Totally.
encourage folks to tap literally their cervix is just a little bit of whatever lube they're comfortable with using. I put a little on the fingers, and then like you said, in the shower or before going to the bathroom with clean hands, you can take a little bit of a squatting position or a leg up, or how you prefer to use your tampons or menstrual cup, and instead of
Mhm.
inserting those foreign objects, insert your own finger and slide it in and reaching with kind of a scooping motion. It's a little bit like a C, scooping in with a hook, kind of. And the cervix is right back there, and you should be able to feel, people say it's like the tip of a nose
Mhm.
with a little pin dot on the top of it when you're in that non-fertile phase. And I
Mhm.
find that it's easier to find the cervix when you're in the non-fertile time because it's right there. And then as it gets softer, it does move higher up. It becomes a little less apparent. And so we have to kind of know what we're looking for.
Right. I've heard it being compared to plastic on infertile days and then
Yeah.
lips on fertile days.
Hmm, that's a good one. I like
Yeah,
that.
because it
Yeah.
feels like it describes it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about how people could be using this incorrectly or tracking their cycle incorrectly. Like, what are the common mistakes that you found in
Yeah.
working with clients?
Yeah. So common mistakes often that I find are with temperature specifically, not having a consistent time that they're taking their temperature. So
Hmm.
temperature is variable to the time that you're taking it and your resting rate of temperature. So they call it basal body temperature because it's that phase where the one we use most common for tracking is first thing in the morning, right after you wake up, before you've gotten your heart rate pumping and you're moving around. And this is important because once we start moving, our temperature can start to experience shifts. So we really want to be taking temperature, if we can, at the same time every day before we're moving around all that much. And
Hmm.
for folks who have variable schedules, we live in these modern times, and there are some pretty cool temperature or thermometers that allow people to record their temperatures while they're sleeping. There's the temp
Hmm.
drop that you can wear on your arm. And I'm old school. I just set an alarm and make sure I do it and I go back to sleep. And so
Hmm.
there's some ways to ensure you're getting it right, but that is important to make sure you're taking temperature at the right time so you're getting
Hmm.
those accurate readings. Um, Another thing I see a lot with cervical fluid is it takes time to tell the difference between the different types of cervical fluid. And especially for folks who have been on hormonal birth control for a long time, or even the copper IUD, because one of the ways they work is by thickening and altering the cervical fluid. We're just not used to seeing the changes. And so it's going to take a little time to get used to them and to not worry if you're not seeing peak fluid right away. Because sometimes as we're transitioning off of birth control, we need time for our body to sync back up to its natural rhythms and to make that egg white type fluid. So that could take a little while. So I
Yeah.
do see that as like people wanting to have it and it's not there, so they're misrecording. But
Hmm.
really, patience is the name of the game with cervical fluid. And it's
Oh, yeah.
to really wait it out and see and make sure you're identifying them all correctly.
Yeah. And something as simple as hydration can really impact
Yeah.
it as well.
Yeah. That's actually a huge one too, especially with certain prescriptions that are being used. So a big one is
Clomid.
antihistamines. People don't realize
Uh-huh.
antihistamines work by drying up your mucus production, and cervical mucus is one of those types of mucus. So antihistamines can totally rewrite what you're seeing in cervical fluid.
Right. And Clomid as well.
Yes, definitely Clomid.
So typically, what I see is about like in the normal range, or what I'd like to see with my patients is about 97 in follicular, around 97. It goes up and down. It's like the stock
Yep.
market. And then it drops and then peaks and then stays up about like 98s.
Yep.
That's typically the normal range that I see. Usually, if it's too low on either end, I start thinking maybe they should talk, get their thyroid tested, different things. What are the normal ranges that you see?
Yeah, I almost always see exactly what you're talking about as well. I think if I was talking about the lower end, we might be in the 96.9 range, but
Hmm.
often it's between, like you said, the follicular phases in the 97 range. You might get a few spikes that go up because of having a little illness or a little bit of
Hmm.
stress or having a rough night's sleep. So you might see those ebbs and flows. And we have
Right.
um, a way to adjust for those for people who are tracking. But then, yeah, once ovulation happens, we're almost always talking the 97.9 and up range to kind of like 98.5, 98.6, and between 97.9 and the 98.5 or 6 range. And then, um, yeah, really trying to take note of what we call the biphasic shift. So, really having it be in that lower phase. There's a little drop off before ovulation, then that peak, and then having it come up and rise over is what we're really looking for as fertility awareness instructors.
Yeah. For me, it's kind of cool because I do Chinese medicine. We're all about the yin and yang, and you could see the complete yin
Yeah.
and yang in it. It's so
Yeah.
cool. It's not something that I
Yeah.
think we can, back in the day, they track like this, obviously, but to
Yeah.
actually see it where we have yin and yang hormones and how it happens in that cycle. And I often talk about the moon in the cycle. And I was wondering, since you work with a lot of
Mm.
people, have you noticed synchronicities with the moon?
Yes, I love this. First, I love that you mentioned the yin and yang because I hadn't sat down to think about that yet. And I mean, I can visualize all the charts I've seen this week in my head, and it's exactly what they look
I'll
like.
send
It's
you if
so
you
true, and
want.
I
I'll
love.
send you
Yeah.
something that I've made. It's kind of like a chart with the yin and yang symbol. You'll love it. I'll send it to
Yeah.
you.
I I would absolutely love that. And to answer your question, I'm often talking about moon cycles, and another leg of my work, I call it the wild woman work because I do think
I
there's
love
so
it.
much more than just this biology of our cycles. There
Hmm.
really is this like mystic wild nature to it. And whether we want to admit to it or not, our cycles have a way when we are cycling naturally to sync themselves up with the moon. And it's quite powerful to see. We think about it often as most folks will ovulate on the full moon or menstruate with the new moon, but we can also see that flipped, and then there's different qualities that are associated with a woman
Hmm.
whose cycle is taking form in that way, and neither one is right or wrong. It's just really
Totally.
cool to
I was a blood
see how they
mooner and I got
manifest.
pregnant, but I was a
Yeah.
blood mooner. It was like on the dot. But they
Yeah.
say that, there's some people that theorize that blood mooners, because most people, the majority of people actually, they'll menstruate with a new moon. But then there's a
Right.
percentage that will menstruate with a full moon, but the percentage is smaller. And what they said is back in the day when everybody would sync up, and we didn't have artificial light, we had moonlight. So it would be
Yep.
easier to sync up, and they would say that the blood mooners tend to be more people who are healers or drawn to healing, because they were the ones that would take care of the women when they were menstruating on the new moon.
Yes, yes, I love this, and I share this with everyone who comes to me that's like, I don't know why my cycle's not how it's supposed to be with the moon. And I was like, that's a beautiful thing. Let's
Yeah.
talk about why that's really wonderful.
Yeah. It's really great. I saw you totally light up when we started talking about that, though. So
Yeah,
so yeah, so
yeah.
do you notice it? Do you see that, like, people do start to sync up with the moon?
I do see that. I see it in my own cycle. I see it with a lot of clients. It's especially powerful to see with the folks who are working with me to transition off of hormonal birth control and to prepare their own natural fertility once I mean, their hormones have been flatlined for so long that now they're syncing up with the natural world, and it's
Hmm.
really miraculous to them. So that's very incredible to watch. And there's even some practices that are mystical in nature around supporting this cycle syncing that we're talking with the moon. You've likely heard of it called lunaception, where folks are using blackout curtains or um, sleeping with eye masks on
Hmm.
throughout their cycle. And then a day or two before the full moon, they sleep without those
I
masks on
never
and they
heard of
expose
that.
themselves to some light to promote ovulation at that time. And then a few days after the moon, they put their mask back on or put their blackout curtains on, and they work to sync their ovulation to the full moon.
Oh, that's so interesting. What I typically tell people is, how sunlight's important. Well, I say get some moonlight, go
Yeah.
outside in the dark, and then just look at the moon, or have some time, because we really entrain with our eyes.
Yeah.
That's why we entrain with the normal time cycle of wherever we are, because if we go into a different time cycle, we can really feel off.
Yes. Yeah. I totally agree. And there's something so powerful about being that connected to the natural world we live in.
Totally. I agree. I'm with you at 100. I mean, that it really is us. That's the thing. We are part of it, and
Yep.
it works in its own balance. And we can, because we're so malleable as humans, because
Yeah.
we're built to entrain. We're built to respond to rhythms. And that's the way we regulate. So if you utilize that by spending some time outside, taking fresh air, just being in nature, you'll start to feel better.
Yes, totally.
Awesome. So if people are interested, how can people find you?
Yes. So anyone who's interested can follow me on Instagram at Sauvage Wellness. I also have a website at the same name, Sauvage Wellness. For anyone who's curious, Sauvage is the French term for wild. So that's kind
Mhm.
of the root of everything that I do is getting at our wild natural rhythms. And I've shared with you, if you're sharing with the folks, my cycle tracking starter guide. It's a free guide that I create for folks who are interested in just starting this practice of reconnecting to their natural cycles and learning what to track and how to track it and to get started at home in a way that's really easy, really straightforward. And then they can choose if they want to take it further for moon syncing or birth control or pregnancy achievement or hormonal health, hormone balancing. There's so many ways to use this powerful tool. So I will share that with you as well if you want to send that out to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your generous offer.
Yeah.
I think people are going to love it. So thank you so much for joining. And I will be putting all your links on the episode notes so everybody can find it if they want. But thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. This has been absolutely wonderful. It was so great to meet you.